Hello everyone, and welcome to the Reading Party podcast with Megan and Lexi. Together, we'll watch, snack, and chat our way through books and films set in the ancient world. We bring our expertise as ancient historians to the table to dissect every detail. We hope you'll grab your favourite beverage and snacks and join us every week on this adventure. Before we start spilling the tea, a brief note on our content. The Reading Party podcast is created for adult audiences. The stories of the ancient world are full of violence and undisguised sexual content, and your hosts aren't afraid to curse up a storm. For those reasons, this podcast is not suitable for under 18s, and certain episodes may not be suitable for those living with trauma. This season, we're focusing on stories set in and around the Roman Empire, including Roman Britain, and we'll be bringing in guest hosts that are subject matter experts to help us really dig into the history of what we're reading and watching. With that in mind, let's get going. Lexi and I have our teas and are so ready to start spilling the tea on a ton of ancient stories. Hello everyone, welcome back to the Reading Party podcast. This is season 3, our Rome Spectacular, and it's a very special episode because we have not one but two guests with us, which I don't think we've done before. We have the wonderful Aaron and Jeff. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us. And I am joined, as always, by Lexi. Lexi, what are you drinking today?
I've got just normal green tea. Very boring,
Perfect.
but delicious.
Perfect. I have iced peach tea because it is ridiculously hot outside. I think we hit 100 degrees today. I don't like it. I'm British. It needs to rain more, frankly.
Ooh.
Unimpressed. Anyway, before the British person on the panel gets into complaining about the weather for too long, I'm going to ask our guests to introduce themselves. So, Aaron, I'm going to ask you to go first. Could you just tell everyone who you are, where you are, and what it is you do?
So I am Aaron Irvin. I am a professor at Murray State University, which is in Western Kentucky. I am a specialist in ancient Rome, though I also dabble in Egypt, in the ancient Near East, specifically the period of the Late Bronze Age, as well as some material in ancient Greece as well. And of course, the reason I'm here today is while I was in grad school at UCLA, I worked on the series Spartacus in all of its various incarnations.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And Jeff, same question for you, please.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jeff Stevens. I'm the ancient historian at the University of Missouri. Similar to Aaron, I worked on the Spartacus series as a grad student at UCLA. Aaron and I went to grad school together, and I've been at the University of Missouri since 2015. I'm currently the director of undergraduate studies, and I do a lot of archaeology in Italy in various contexts, and I'm excited to start a new dig in a couple of weeks. Very nice to be here.
Thank you very much. And as you've both mentioned, we are here today to talk about Spartacus, the Starz series Spartacus, Blood and Sand, which I had not watched prior to prepping for this episode. And we are focusing explicitly on episodes 5 and 6. But just to get everyone kind of caught up to the same place in the story, I'm going to give a lightning fast plot recap so all our listeners know where we are. We open with Spartacus, who's not actually called Spartacus. We don't know what his name is at this point in the story, but when he gets to Rome, he is christened Spartacus. But he is a Thracian warrior who ends up enlisting in the Roman Auxiliary Corps to try and defend his village from some attackers. Ultimately, he ends up deserting to go and, save his village, which was the whole point of him signing on in the first place. He rescues his wife from some would-be rapists. I should say, before we really get into this, there is a lot of violence. There is a lot of sexual assault going on here. Listen with care, people, and definitely watch with care, because, dear God, that is more blood and nudity than I have ever seen on the television. The nudity doesn't bother me. The blood, that was a lot of blood. And interesting. Anyway, sorry, brief aside there. He saves his wife, rescues her from these rapists. They run away, and then he's caught by the Roman officer that he threw a spear at, never a good idea, and left for dead. So Roman officer takes him and wife as slaves, separates them both. Spartacus is shipped off to Capua, supposedly to die in the ring as a form of execution, except plot twist, he does not die. He kills all of his gladiator rivals and ends up being bought by a kind of gladiator trainer called Batiatus. Batiatus is down on his luck. He doesn't have an awful lot of money and is trying throughout the series very desperately to kind of get his fortunes back on track. And the rest of the episodes up to episode 6 kind of follow Spartacus's journey in the gladiatorial training school, the ludus. He loses a fight and gets sent down to the pits, which, my God, looked terrifying. Very interested to hear about any kind of historical background on those. Ends up saving Batiatus' life and is kind of reborn as a gladiator again. There's also a lot of like masculine posturing in this, and apparently like gladiators are the elite, like let's call them elite football players, because why not? And the guys who fight in the pits are really not. So while Spartacus is in the pits, he's like getting spat on and looked down upon by the rest of the gladiators in the school. Very strange, very strange. Anyway, sorry, another brief aside there. Spartacus gets kind of elevated back up to gladiator, and episode 6 is about Spartacus and Crixus, who is a Gaul undefeated gladiator, kind of training to fight this absolutely terrifying undefeated gladiator whose name I can't remember because I didn't write it down, but he's a giant dude with really long white hair and is terrifying. And yes, Crixus dies. Very sad. I mean, genuinely sad. He's a bit of a dick, but you know, he didn't deserve to die like that. And his girlfriend and his mistress being the woman who owns him, who also happens to be sleeping with him. So, you know, the term works both ways, are like watching from the stands, and it is all a little bit sad. And Spartacus wins. He kills the giant, terrifying man, and everyone is very, very excited. I should also mention, you know, the central plot line, which I've completely glossed over. Spartacus is doing all of this to try and find his wife. She's been sent off. We don't really know where. Batiatus says with a Syrian. Do we trust Batiatus? I don't. So Spartacus is kind of fighting to try and either find her himself or have someone else find her and rescue her. And he keeps having these dreams about her. So that's lightning speed. I've missed so much stuff, but it kind of gets you to where we are. Episode 5 focuses on Spartacus' time in the pit, fighting down there to try and either make Batiatus back some money and then to kind of secure the safety of his wife. And then episode 6 is focusing on the build up to this really big fight in the gladiatorial arena. Lexi, what did I miss?
Wait, no, hang on. Sorry. I was like, wait, I think my episodes are off. No, 5 is the fight. And 6 is him getting his wife back, but she's
I watched the
dead.
damn episodes.
4 is
Jesus.
4 is the pit.
Okay, well, everyone listening, this is going to be much more amusing than it normally is because I'm flying blind for half of it. So, episode 5 is the giant fight. Episode 6 is the reuniting with his wife, which I didn't know happened. So I'm very glad that he gets his wife back.
No, she's dead. But spoiler, she's dead.
And to comfort you,
of course she's dead.
Die.
Yeah, Crixus
does not die.
He appears to die if you've only seen 5. If you see 6, you know he's just very badly injured and like kind of not even. You see his body trying to recover.
There's
for
like
2
entrails
seconds.
coming out of him.
Not good shape.
I am glad he's not dead.
Yeah,
he's badly injured. It's going to be a solid while before he's able to walk. Let's just say that.
Well, this is going to just add intrigue to the plot because we've still got this whole love triangle thing going on then with a interest. Mm-hmm. Okay, fantastic. Well, it turns out I missed an awful lot, so apologies for that, gentlemen. Usually I'm better prepared than this.
It's fine. Really, episode 6 is literally like Aftermath, which is just Batiatus is like, we got to tie our fortune to Spartacus now, and we can't let him go, and we can't let him have his wife. So we're gonna play this dirty game of I promised to reunite him, but did not promise the condition she'd be returned, which is essentially beat to shit and essentially DOA, dead on arrival. Which was very sad. But yeah, that was
episode 6 is literally everybody betraying everybody in the show. Mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. Every character is backstabbing every other character. It's like a circle where everybody is stabbing each other in the back. That's episode 6.
And it does end though with Spartacus accepting his new situation essentially and doing homage to the I am Spartacus line. So there are all kinds of things that the writers tied in that don't necessarily have to do with the old Spartacus stories, but do have to do with what it means to be Spartacus and how he's represented in the modern age.
Very interesting.
Yeah. So, Megan, I'm going to let you take the first one if you want, because I'm sure you have something. I can also do it, but I thought I'd give you the chance.
The problem is my first question was about the pits, and we're not not talking about that episode.
I mean, no, you
So-
go ahead. We can talk about
No,
anything within the first
I-
6.
yeah.
I just
Before,
I just wanted to ask, like, was this a thing, or was this something that was made up for the show?
Jeff,
This kind of underground
go,
fighting, brutal
just take
thing.
it, Jeff.
I'll tell you, this is a thing that was very much created by the writers for their own purposes. It was one of the bigger problems that Aaron and I had with the first season, is that they wanted this to be, for a variety of their own reasons. Aaron and I have our, theories on what some of those, might be or not, but they seemed to want to have this kind of arc of an even more extreme place and an even more extreme situation outside of the state-sanctioned violence that was available.
I was going to say he's a slave being forced to fight for his life. I'm not really sure we need a more extreme stage.
But they did want to separate it. You could see them trying to separate that there are these elements in the social conditioning of the ludus where they can create kind of a sense of honor amongst those gladiators. And we do have, historical evidence for seeing, how those gladiators could conceive of themselves, that they would, through that social conditioning and extreme circumstances. There are some, examples of them embracing different aspects of their identity as gladiators. And so the pits served to be something outside of that. It kind of, had a lot of different, elements thrown into it, but it was designed as this kind of vehicle for Spartacus to rise back out of. But it does not have the same historical footing that a lot of other aspects of the show do. And I will let Aaron chime in with some of his thoughts on the pits, because we both have our thoughts on the pits.
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, the pits make no sense at all. You already have state-sanctioned violence, the idea that you have to go underground and be secret about having your slaves fight. It doesn't make any... You already have them fighting in public in front of a giant crowd. So there's no reason to be secretive about it. There's no reason to go into an underground barn and hold it where nobody can see it. It doesn't make any sense. The idea was, again, like Jeff said, this is another level where Spartacus has fallen even further into degradation, and he's gone even lower. Well, the reality was that historically Gladiator was as far as you could fall. He's already at the bottom of the heap. In this period in particular, gladiators were failed slaves, effectively, where if there was any other way that you could make a buck off of them, if there was anything else that they could do, you would do that with the slave. This is a slave that is unruly, they are violent, they're basically, you can't do anything with them. So let's make their death entertaining. Let's get something out of them. That's what a gladiator is. So the pits, again, this doesn't make any sense. There's no reason for it. It's a plot device. It's for the development of the character of Spartacus. What we did, though, for the show was, okay, this doesn't make any sense. If this thing did exist, though, what would this look like? How would this operate? How might this sort of exist within the ideas that the writers wanted to use? And so, even though we could say, all right, historically, this doesn't make any sense, how do we contextualize something like this? Where would it be located? What would it look like? What kind of facilities would be used? And this was one of the, like Jeff said, kind of the first big challenges we ran into, where the writers wanted to go completely off the map and literally like into fantasy world. We're going to make this place up. And rather than just be like, no, we're not going to play. Well, we're going to take our history books and go home. Our response was, okay, how do we make this happen, right? How do we still work within history, even though this is completely made up and there is no context for it? And so when you're looking at it, okay, it's entertaining, it's secret, it's in the back. Well, why is it secret? Who would be there? Who is going to be watching this thing? What kinds of activities are going to be there? Why are these individuals who aren't otherwise going to be going to the games? And so that's kind of what you see at the pits, is this is something that it's already so bad, so backwards, so dark, so evil that even the Romans who are like, we're going to watch fat guys kill each other for fun. They're looking at what's going on in the pits going, that's a step too far for us, dude. We're looking at, the Romans are looking at the pits going, that's dark and weird, and we're not going to put up with that. And so that was the idea behind the pits.
We also were able to put some other elements in terms of was viewed as a completely unsavory and dangerous place. And therefore, even Gladiatus going there, he needed Barca with him to literally protect him. And so we have violence come in there in a different context because it is the type of place where maybe anything could go on. Episode 4, you see that attempt made on Gladiatus's life. And Barca being there also does show one historical role that gladiators over time could play, especially in the late Republic, in that we do have later accounts. It's a touch later than the period of the show, but we do have essentially political violence on the streets, goon squads for even elite politicians, gladiators used as goon squads. You can't always tell if they're actually trained gladiators or they're just kind of, toughs that are assigned the name gladiator, because they will start to use the term gladiator as a pejorative just in general because they are so contemptible. So you a lot of times see guys that are just kind of an entourage or a goon squad that might have the term gladiator applied to them. That may mean that they were really trained to do that and there was a concern, and other times it gets thrown around a bit loosely. But we have various examples of this characterization of kind of like gladiator goons that will show up in the entourages of even powerful and significant individuals in the late Republic. It's a little bit later than the show typically in a lot of the evidence that we have, but some of that's just because the time period of our show is a bit of a black hole, even in terms of historical sources in some ways.
Oh man. Okay, I have a Varro question because I haven't watched this in years, but I was reminded how much I love Varro. I mean, he's our boy, right? Our bestie. Well, Spartacus's bestie, I should say. It occurred to me that when he gets his big introduction, and he's kind of like, okay, who are you? Why are you here? You're not like Crixus and these other terrible people. And then he goes, yeah, I'm here. I'm a volunteer. And then it sort of reminded me of, the gladiator backgrounds was all coming back, especially when looking at my notes. But so from what I apparently remembered was that, so the main gladiator sort of backgrounds were like the slaves, like prisoners of war, condemned criminals, and the volunteers. But I wanted to ask specifically, did you guys have any sort of say over kind of the portrayal of what could be added in telling a story about a volunteer and what kind of volunteers would be allowed to or should or would even think of putting themselves through this experience with criminals?
Yeah, so for Varro, he and Asher kind of started off as the same character. In fact, you might almost think of them as like sort of a character and a half. The original name was just sort of Friendliest, literally is what he was called, and he was sort of the fixer and the guy who could get people or get things for you, and he was also smart. And then they kind of split eventually into Asher and Varro over time. And the idea that we do have records of these figures who would go into debt and sell themselves into slavery and then sell themselves into gladiatorial schools for a period of time. And for free individuals in particular, this was very, very attractive, especially as we're heading into this period and gladiatorial games are becoming more of a public spectacle, much more of a big deal, because then you would come out of that period, assuming you survived, of course, and you would have this reputation as essentially this warrior, this kind of a badass, and you had done all of these great things, and you could take that reputation and do something with it. Now, you still were sort of ashamed of that. You couldn't take that and then get into politics because you had essentially been a flesh peddler. You had been almost the equivalent of like a male prostitute. So you weren't going to come out of that career and then become a politician or a senator or anything like that later on. In fact, there are actually laws passed once we get into the empire restricting some of the members of the equestrian class and the senatorial class from even pretending to be gladiators and putting on that type of a show. The idea of, again, gaining that celebrity status, but then trying to be political and powerful and so on and so forth. So it was this idea of, all right, what kind of a person is going to be drawn to that? Where they're not going to be political, they're going to be from this sort of middle, lower class background. They can get into debt, but they also are of some degree of property where they can get themselves out of debt. They can sell themselves into slavery with the idea of also being able to get out of slavery as well. And so it's playing with the Roman class system in a way that other series, other shows, other stories about the Republic and the Empire haven't really dealt with in the past. And that was really one of the cool things about the show, is that we dealt with levels of Roman society that none of these other series had really dealt with before. I think the only other one was, what's it called? Plebs is a British comedy. But again, it's a comedy. So it's also, they don't try to be historically accurate. They're like, make jokes about modern day and it's out of context and so on and so forth. But that idea of dealing with what would it actually be like to be a regular everyday Roman? What would it actually be like to be this, middle class, upper middle class, lower middle class Roman, and not a senatorial elite? What are the regular everyday people like who aren't participating in the political intrigue of I, Claudius? How does this affect them in their everyday lives? And so that's where characters like Varro came in. Regular everyday guy, gets into trouble. So why is he going to be in the gladiatorial school? How is this person drawn into this type of position?
And, with that type of gladiator, this Octoratus type gladiator, where you're basically taking your oath and going in and agreeing to be in this debased situation for a while. For the Roman elite, especially the more traditional and conservative elements of the Roman elite, even considering doing that, even the oath itself is described, I believe it's Seneca that describes it as like the most shameful of all oaths, there are good oaths and bad oaths, and actually to take an oath that you're going to, the oath that we use in the show, it's taken from elements of Petronius and Seneca, kind of hybridized. It doesn't actually apply properly to slave gladiators per se. Those are things that we were moving around a bit to conform to the show, but it was viewed as fundamentally dishonorable for a free person to then go into that most debased status. And for some Romans, that's unthinkable for those Romans on high. But as you're looking at the different classes of Roman society, life is life. Life is complicated. People can find themselves in a lot of different situations where they have to make tough decisions, or they can have personalities that are motivated by a variety of things, both good and bad. And we do have some evidence of these, freeborn, individuals that choose to go into this status thinking that they can gain something out of it and get something back out of it. They could wind up dead. They could wind up not successful enough to maybe, necessarily buy their way back out. A lot of these things might have been done based on time or something. There are other ways that this could be done, but we do have, this type that existed. And then by using, Varro in that, we tried to show in the ludus itself many different, the many different backgrounds you could come from and wind up in this situation. And even though most of it was in this slavery context, we also wanted to show the multifaceted nature of the slave system itself. That when you think of a slave or the slave system, it's not one thing. And especially from a modern context, we don't easily understand all of the nuances of how ubiquitous and how insidious a larger slave system is, and how it can actually condition people in so many different ways, to essentially bolster, how it's basically perpetrated upon people. And people are, willing to move through various ways and accept things in a variety of ways. And that's one thing that I did find myself very proud about, how Blood and Sand especially did some things, is essentially the upstairs downstairs dynamic that, there are old contexts even in British society and British pop culture about upstairs downstairs, the old show. And then this show, I think, popped just a little bit before Downton Abbey and other things. And we actually have these write-ups that are comparing the portrayal of kind of servant, non-servant between Downton Abbey and Spartacus. And once I saw articles being written about that, I'm like, okay, we at least sparked a debate on some things. And it was actually, I was pretty happy that people engaged with the nuances of how complex life can be and how these slave institutions are just much more nuanced and complicated than people often take them for at their face value.
I wanted to ask, talking about social classes and various hierarchies, how the hierarchy portrayed in the ludus you think maps onto what we might expect in an historical setting. And when Varro joins and Spartacus talks to him, he's very disparaging of all of the other new recruits because they're all like criminals, essentially. And Varro is like, I'm a free person. I'm here because I have to provide for my wife and my child. Was there that kind of, sorry, I'm forming this question as I talk. Is his attitude reflective, do you think, of how free people would have viewed gladiators? And the same hierarchy question, like, do you think that hierarchy represented would have been similar in ancient times?
I think it would have been similar in some ways. The thing is how even Roman society at its different levels viewed gladiators and how the elements within a gladiator school had their own hierarchy and how they might view each other is very complicated. It probably would depend on time period, location. I think that it even probably matters ludus to ludus, even who is actually in charge. Now, unfortunately, the sources try to lay all the blame of the breakout to basically deflect from the Romans questioning the institution of slavery or the institution of the games in some way. They try to lay too much of the blame on Gladiatus and mismanagement. That's the way that the Roman sources tend to want to shift blame. That said, you would have good managers, bad managers. You would have different forms of hierarchy that might develop ludus to ludus, but you would also have the traditions probably perpetrated by the various gladiator trainers or people that had come up through the system and actually gained freedom and become, one of the gladiator trainers in some way. What we did try to show, though, is that we did think of the ludus as a bit of kind of a controlled prison environment. And if you think of a U.S. prison, especially, think about the gangs, the hierarchy within, the way that any show or any people's experience with the U.S. penal system, you have that type of hierarchy where you can have gangs formed around ethnicity or identity or various other things like that. And we wanted to show that in the sources we can actually see a hierarchy probably within different ethnic groups. So they would have their own internal hierarchy. They would interact and compete with each other potentially within a ludus. And when the Spartacus rebellion does break out, we see that kind of that factionalism play out in the sources as well. But this is not some kind of monolithic cohesive structure. And so the hierarchies are going to exist in Roman society with probably different attitudes about how they view the gladiators, with many of the more conservative elite viewing them almost potentially with the most contempt, but actually exploiting them for their own purposes in various ways. The middle class Romans, you might have a pretty wide spectrum of some that view gladiators as truly monstrous, shameful, with this dark stigma and infamia, and others that might not, might view the more popularized aspect of them and get really into them. And so we would see a spectrum in society about how gladiators are viewed. And I do think within the ludus itself, we have evidence of kind of various rankings, different forms of organization along gladiatorial type, or how successful different gladiators are in terms of their ranking and worth. This becomes more developed later on in the empire, where we have better evidence for this. In this period of Spartacus, it probably is in a period of transition, and the late Republic itself is, showing a bit of chaos. And there's been a lot of violence outside of the arena too, politically. Rome itself is in a period of transformation. This great, period that's been going on for decades before Spartacus's rebellion, and then will continue on until it is reformed, into the empire itself. And so what we probably get is a great degree of variation, but definitely hierarchies are going to exist in all aspects of this, both in and out of the ludus. And then you'll probably see some difference in how those hierarchies are structured and how they operate from ludus to ludus as well.
Yeah, and just to sort of jump off of that too, the big thing to keep in mind is that there wasn't necessarily a social stigma against being a slave per se. Slaves could be highly educated. Doctors were slaves, bankers were slaves. Most skilled tradesmen throughout the empire at the time of the show is set were slaves who had individuals who had actually willingly sold themselves into slavery in order to gain a degree of social and legal protection from a Roman patron. There was the expectation that even if you were a slave, you would likely be freed in your master's will and therefore become a libertus, which was essentially legal status the same as a child of your master. You were an heir with the estate. You took your master's name. You were a member of their household. So just because you were a slave in that moment didn't necessarily give you a social stigma, and individuals were fully aware of the fact that you might be a slave, but a couple years down the line, you might own an extensive estate, you might have significant power, authority, social status, and so on. Within the ludus, though, like Jeff was saying a moment ago, these are bottom of the barrel slaves. This is, it's not just simply that they're slaves, these are gladiators. These are failed slaves. These guys couldn't hack it as tools, as objects within the Roman world. And so that's more the reason why Varro is sort of looking down on them. He has an identity. He is a Roman. He is, yes, there is that, this comes through in the character. There is that shame that he is in debt, and Romans hated debt more than anything else. And this is something that other societies were actually able to take advantage of because the Romans were happy to lend tons of money out to everybody in the Mediterranean that then these various societies would actually use as leverage against them because, well, now you have to support these various kings and keep them in power if you want your money back. But the Romans thought debt was the worst possible thing. So Varro, as a Roman in debt, this shows you sort of how far he has fallen, how desperate he is, how willing he is to sort of take care of his family and do what must be done. But he is still, I'm a Roman, I'm different. This is the bottom of the barrel, but I'm not like them. I am not this sort of failed human being like the other individuals within the ludus that I am surrounded by. So it's not necessarily slavery, it's gladiators. It's these are tools that are here, these are people that are here just to die. I'm not like them.
One thing that I think probably Megan knows way too well is that one of the biggest gripes I have with most representations of Roman daily life is the utter lack of pueri, right? And I'm like, okay, I get it. We don't need to see it. Some people might find that not great, but in a show that surprisingly, is not afraid to tackle so many different levels of enslaved persons, that got me sort of thinking, like, because I do complain a lot about HBO Rome just because I'm like, you have a great opportunity. We don't really see them, or they don't really talk about it. So for this one, that got me thinking, like, would you even have pueri in a ludus running around anyway? Or was that something really reserved for, like, no, they would be up kind of near the rich people's, personal villas or whatever? Yeah.
I'll let you go on that one.
No, go ahead. This is your area.
Well, in this case, I would think that what you're going to see with that is mostly in a more wealthy context where it's going to be shown, but you're going to see some of this anywhere and everywhere, but it's a matter of how you're actually trying to portray it and what is being emphasized. And you have to remember with all of these shows, they are kind of wanting to reflect things from a modern context where they want to actually approach it in a particular way. So all of these things are somewhat modern commentary on this and how you're actually going to do this. And I do think that you have to take into account sensibilities of a modern audience anytime you go down these various roads. And when you choose what you can do and not do. It is often dictated by the time period in which the show is set in a modern context. And what I will say is you have to remember this show itself also came out a touch before Game of Thrones. It had its own agenda in terms of wanting to push about as much as it could onto cable television at the time that it could, but it also had to be very, very careful in terms of how far you go in showing any particular thing one way or another. And because of what this show did want to emphasize at the time, I think the decisions were made that it had to steer clear of representations of certain things because it was going to push the limit on other things, if you know what I mean with that. And there are ways that this show presented certain things then from, 13, 14, 15 years ago then, that it probably wouldn't make even the same choices now. And so you have to also, that this is always kind of a calculated thing in that regard. And I think that they wanted to push the extremes on one side, so they weren't necessarily going to do that on the other side. Let's put it that way, even though the reality historically is you would probably have a wide degree of interactions at all different levels of society that may not be the most comfortable thing to actually watch. Let's put it that way.
That's totally fair. Totally fair. I mean, I figured normally because you don't really want to offend your audience, I guess. I mean, they're going to be offended by some things, but yeah.
Now, one thing I do want to say in terms of the level of violence, the level of sexual, there were also choices made that even in the arena with that level of overt violence, they wanted to shoot this thing in a more stylized way. And there is an advantage to doing that where a lot of the gore, as over top as it is and as extreme as it is, does not really look real. It just doesn't look real. That there's a certain kind of detachment from that because it is very stylized. It looks more, CGI in various ways. It looks like in play. But what that actually does is it does probably protect, from offending too wide of a nature of that. I mean, and this show can push the limits. But the reality is you are creating a bit of a psychological buffer when your eye knows that what you're seeing, no matter how brutal, how gross, how over the top, how bizarre it looks, it's not real. Your eye can actually see that. And to some extent, and this is where the historical aspect of this comes in, the Romans themselves were not always just wanting pure bloodbath and everything. That's not the way. They may be portrayed that way in the show, but it's not. Part of the reason that a lot of the gladiators were eventually given helmets and put helmets on is so that you could actually cover up the face to probably, create that bit of separation emotionally. You're not going to have empathy or sympathy, in this case. Now, what's interesting is in the early gladiatorial context, you maybe could see their face. Or with the Retiarius type, with the net fighters, there were comments about that was one of the, later appeals that some emperors even like, that you could actually see the distress, the pain, the anxiety of the fight itself because you could actually see their face. But part of the reason for, the helmets, to some extent is to break that connection, with the crowd. And it works a little bit that way, even in modern sports and things like that, in that if you notice, even in, U.S. society and even in, where you have, coverage of everything, while in the United States, the NFL may be dominant football-wise, most people are going to pull for teams as what they're rooting for. When you look at basketball, even soccer, some other things, sometimes we can get a little bit closer. A lot of times the stars start to matter a bit more. And in those sports, you can actually see the individual that often people will root with. And as those stars change teams, people will often follow the stars. You don't see that in American football as much with the helmets. They're often kind of rooting for one team or another. Now, it doesn't hold in all ways, but there is something about kind of the increased individuality that can be expressed, in sports outside of things that have helmets or that. And so there are these kind of psychological nuances that go into that. And the Romans, I think, kept most gladiatorial types helmeted, at least, once the games had developed a bit, and then made exceptions from that. There are types that don't do that. But that is to kind of create a bit of a barrier to prevent empathy or sympathy. And we do have evidence sometimes that Roman crowds, as bloodthirsty as they are, they might have empathy for not liking, the reaction of even elephants, in the beast hunts or something like that. The Roman crowd is not just there for pure slaughter. That there are all of these different elements, and a lot of times they view the gladiators in the arena as deserving of their fate. And you are seeing that reinforcing of a certain degree of state power and state violence over the deserving. But even in that, you'll sometimes see this barrier created probably to not offend certain sensibilities, even for the Romans. And the Roman crowd is going to be a lot harder to offend than a modern audience. So think about that when you're thinking about how all these shows choose to do what and when and the time period that they're doing. There are these calculations. How do you attract the widest audience? How do you push the limits on what TV will allow while not alienating too much of the audience? And things that were allowed to go even 10, 15 years ago would probably be done a little bit differently now in terms of modern sensibilities, in terms of capturing the audience. And that will also determine what's shown on screen and the different types of characters shown on screen, even though our show pushed the limits about as far as would be allowed for its day.
There's a lot of that built in. It was interesting. I just want to say it's a really interesting analogy to the sports teams and the covering of the faces, because I also kind of noticed a trend of like when we would see glimpses of these battles in the arena portrayed, I felt like almost every sort of armor set, helmet type I was seeing, they were all for like Thraxes and Murmillos. And I was like, okay, but like, where's the other stuff? Because they didn't all wear those specific armor sets, but those happen to be the biggest. I was like, oh, well, that might be interesting. If you don't want to see stuff, then use that. It's interesting.
That said, the show, we start pulling things from different time periods for just variants. They want visual variants. They want different typologies. So we have things going on in this time period that are not set specifically for this time period, but they have some historical basis. And then even though Aaron and I would comment on a variety of how things are going to be portrayed, realize that a lot of this is going to be decided in set production and costume design, and we will have some input, but they're ultimately going to come up with how they choose to portray. And even the way that they were employing Sikas, as I went back and watched these early episodes, they wanted to show a Sika, but they're often not quite right, and they're also not necessarily being used quite right in the arena. And I noticed that again as I rewatched it, these episodes the last few days. You could tell that some hints were coming in, and then they're putting in weapons in this show that would not have been used in the arena. And that's just writer's choice and preference for various reasons. And I'll let Aaron comment some more on that stuff.
Well, just to go off of that idea of teams, I believe it's one of the emperors, I believe it was Domitian, was said to have particularly hated the Thrax style gladiator. So along that idea of looking at this as teams. So whenever there was a Thrax, it didn't matter who the particular fighter was. If he was a Thrax style gladiator, the emperor would root against him. So exactly that idea of looking at the armor style, the fighting style as a type, and so on. Another point, sort of approaching, the idea, Lexi, that you brought up from another angle, the armor of the guards. In the first few episodes, we went with the lorica, the plate mail, because it was expected, it was assumed that that's what the audience would want to see when it came to Roman guards and Roman soldiers and so on. And that's what was available. Well, we got response from the audience. And of course, the Romans at the time wore more of a chainmail type of armor. And when it became clear that the audience was aware of that, and the audience was like, wait a second, we know that the Romans didn't dress that way at the time, the show changed up the armor for the soldiers. But it was all about presenting to the audience Romans that the audience could identify as Romans, right? It didn't matter whether it was historically accurate or not. What mattered was, could the audience identify these guys as Romans? And so as soon as it was clear, okay, the audience knows that this armor is wrong, let's go to the historically accurate armor and flip that around. We had the messaging. Again, you brought up the issue of the pueri, the idea of, again, the presence of younger children, the idea of these younger individuals as slaves, in the ludus as gladiators, around as servants, and so on. Is that something that we want to have? Is that something that we want to communicate? Well, the show was praised in a variety of different ways for the way that it dealt with same sex relationships, for the way that it dealt with same sex attraction. Of course, later on, you have the Negron relationship as the, the one true relationship, the real victors of the series, and so on. That would have been treated very, very differently if we had introduced children into the mix. That's a very, very different message once you put this. So, what is the story that we want to tell? What is the messaging that we want to get across about the period to the audience? Yes, this is accurate, but how is that going to be received? Right? There's another topic, and I bring this up because this is still a part of my research when it came to purification rituals. One of the purification rituals that we brought up involves throwing puppies into a big bonfire after they've wandered around a cursed area. And we brought this up. And believe it or not, Lucy Lawless did not want to be on camera throwing puppies into a bonfire. So, yeah, that got nixed. For whatever reason, she did not want to be seen in front of an audience killing puppies. And again, I bring this up because this is a central, I actually study this cult still study and trace this ceremony, the puppy cult sacrifice and so on and so forth. But this is another issue, again, perfectly historically accurate, tons of records for this. I study this, I present on this, I've written book chapters. I'm actually working on a monograph on this to this day. All sorts of history behind it. No way this is ever going to show up in the TV series where we're killing puppies on screen. So there is still, yeah, that audience reaction that has to be kept in mind. It doesn't matter how historically accurate it is. You've got to play towards, is the audience going to get it? Is the audience going to understand it? Yeah.
And Pompey, as I mentioned before, Pompey the Great himself made that big mistake one time thinking that he's going to show these elephants and have a great crowd reaction. Absolutely blew up in his face because the Roman crowd did not like that elephant thing. They just did not like the reactions of the elephants. They didn't like what was going on. It backfired. And so even Roman politicians have to, figure out, okay, what's the crowd and the audience actually want? And we do see in Blood and Sand how many times, Gladiatus is trying to gauge, okay, where's this crowd going to go mentally, and trying to exploit it for his own purposes. And then we see the concerns of the magistrates as well. They pay for something, they want something presented in a particular way to make them look in a good light, and they're constantly trying to have to assess, is this thing that I'm sponsoring and paying for and putting on actually having the right effect for what they want for their position in society? And that's why you do see the concern in, ongoing as they're trying to gauge that in various ways.
Megan, did you have another question, or I can throw another one out there?
I'm kind of ruminating on costuming, which you briefly touched on with the Romans' armor a lot. So I know very little about Roman clothing. So I don't know if my response is just born of ignorance or if there is actually something off going on. The costuming for the upper class women seems very boob heavy when they're actually wearing clothing. I mean, we do the first time we see a Roman woman, she's somehow made it through camp wearing essentially a wolf coat and she's totally nude underneath. I'm like, you have to be freezing, lady. So that's a whole thing. But when they're actually clothed, they're beautiful costumes, absolutely stunning. But I wanted to ask if either of you, what your thoughts are on them. Are they what we might expect for upper class Roman women? I know when Lucretia goes out, she does have a veil kind of over her hat thing, but are they dressed as we would expect? Because I was under the impression that there might be a little bit more modesty. And obviously, everything we've just said about playing to a modern audience completely stands here. But I don't know if I'm reacting to something that actually isn't a thing.
Yeah, I think the playing to the modern audience still is sort of the underlying feature there. I mean, I can't Honestly, I can't praise the costuming department enough. They did a fantastic job, really on their own. I think we gave some input on some of the footwear and on a couple of features, but the costuming people that they brought in really did a great job in terms of fabrics and the look and referring to statues and artworks and so on. But it is tailored and designed and so on for obviously the gaze of a modern audience. So, yeah, very much emphasizing boobage and curves and hips and so on, not in a way that the Romans would not have been able to with the fabrics and with the technology that they had at the time. When you are talking about upper class women, of course, especially senatorial wives, which we don't really have any real upper class women in the series. Even at best, Alithia is sort of kind of an up and coming woman, but even she's not that big of a deal quite yet. There's no way they would be seen in public, period. They would be veiled and behind escorts and litters. And so you would not see them at all. So, what you do see, this is sort of, again, this idea of upper middle class, where, and again, in Capua, you could get away with this. You want to be seen. You are sort of flaunting wealth in a way that you couldn't do in Rome. You are flaunting luxury and excess and the fact that you can buy these fabrics and these styles in a way that wealthy women, powerful women, again, they would not be allowed to do this if they were in the city of Rome and if they were of any sort of political importance. You simply would not see them at all. And again, all of that underlined for a modern audience, sort of restyled for a more modern gaze.
And with this, especially even if you think about Lucretia, as really kind of the centerpiece, character, because Lucy plays her so great, and Lucy's just great in general. But also remember that the ludus itself, because it is a place of gladiators, Lanista, Badiatus's character, is viewed with a great degree of shame as well. That's not considered a proper profession. That there is over time a sense of infamia and shame that gets applied to that as well. That you are kind of a flesh peddler. That said, they are very useful and important to the elite, and they're often, a lot of these guys might be put in place as kind of buffers for the people that are more powerful above them. The people above them want to exploit the games and do these things, but they don't always want to get their hands dirty. A lanista is there to get their hands dirty. They are viewed as that kind of an operator. They are making a living off of the peddling of flesh. Gladiators themselves, as Aaron mentioned before, could be viewed as akin to prostitutes, that you're basically surviving, either being forced to or making money off of the edification of others. And with that, Lucretia's character, and Lucy plays her so great, that's the wife of a lanista. That's not, some Roman senator, with some great lineage. That said, money does matter and roles in society do matter. And sometimes these various players, because they are willing to get their hands dirty, can maybe get a little bit of kind of useful local status and useful local juice, but that can fade very quickly, as happens in the show. You'll see periods where Badiatus and Lucretia are riding high, and then other periods where it's not looking so good. And so you have that. But in that, Lucretia, especially in an area that has more Greek influence, is closer to the sea, has more connections to all of these various things, Lucretia might be a figure that does dress a bit more flashy than, say your average, even middle class Roman woman in some ways. That there are some things going on there in the ludus, in this particular region outside of Rome, that might allow a little more leeway. And the costuming, people actually, the audience generally loves so many of these costumes. And even if not historically accurate, as Aaron said, I do think that the costume people did a great job. And Aaron and I would chime in every once in a while, and we could send images of certain weapons and other things. But for the most part, these costume people, they had kind of, their sources and things that they were pulling from. And, even if everything's not perfectly historically accurate, the costumes, I think, just turned out really well in the show overall.
I have to say, for all that I'm not usually someone who enjoys very gory watching, the costuming and the overall look of the show was very, very well done. It was all very coherent and cohesive, and it was really quite immersive. It was very easy to kind of imagine myself in that area with these people around me. It was really good.
Great to hear. And the show did do quite well for a long time and still does, even this many years afterwards. You know, it is surprising how it holds up in many ways. As I said, if it was to be done some different choices have to be made in terms of modern audience taste compared to modern audience taste even 10, 15 years ago. Aaron and I, realize that too.
Okay, I can throw one out here. So I was just curious how much input you guys would have had in terms of shoving in. I mean, you did great with so many different sort of historical details and stuff. So one thing I notice is language a lot and kind of use of terms. And I am a big believer in using really popular like public media like this as a chance to sort of teach people, right? Because I always kind of believe that if you just teach people this is what it was called, then they'll learn it if they like the show. And so when I'm thinking about kind of like the gladiator types, the names of, certain gladiator types, but even down to the equipment, right? As we have the blunt wooden practice swords, which we call them ruduses. So I was wondering, did you get any direction, or did they think it would be too confusing if, you tried to be like, yes, let's just call them ruduses because this is what they use, the training swords? Because I just found it a little funny when we were getting that whole one of the many sequences where Spartacus is being trained and he's learning how things work. And I think I heard someone be like, pick up your training sword or use the wooden sword. And I was like, oh, okay, like, fine. I guess we need to know what it is. But you could like show it and then call it what it is. And so, yeah, how much input did you have over language stuff? And I would say that also just the training sequences that they did have, like, I understand why they wouldn't do it, but it was also kind of a lost opportunity in my opinion, as someone who really, really likes shoving as much history as possible. I wish that they had done a thing where like you learn with Spartacus about the different gladiator types, like, hey, this guy over here, yeah, this dude, he's going to come at you. He's got a net, so he's a retiarius. Or this guy over here, he has a spear and a dagger, so he's a hoplomachus or something. Yeah.
As the episodes go by, you do see more of that. And I don't remember, it maybe didn't hit in 106, but I think it hits in 107. And I had to go back and listen to it. But Badiatus does say retiarius. He does use the term, but I don't think it happens until 6 or probably even 7. We do get reference to a rudus, I believe, later on, but I don't think I recall hearing it in the first. We give them all of these terms. They have them all of these writers. And you have to realize Aaron and I worked with many, many, many different writers, and each episode has different writing teams. And there is rotation even there. And then Stephen Estenitis, the showrunner, has to try to, put all of these, parts together, in terms of various things. And then what happens down in New Zealand, with the directors and, the production crew. There are lots of different moving parts. They do have access to all of these terms. What you'll see is different typologies will be mentioned going forward. More and more terms get inserted. I can get a few legit names of both individuals and, weapons or typologies inserted over time. Pronunciation becomes its own trick, because what you'll see is when the actors start running their lines, that even if we're giving them the proper terms, you also have the ancient way things might be pronounced. You might even have medieval Latinized ways. Then you have kind of modern common ways that certain names and terms are pronounced. It's a mix and match. And so you won't always even get consistent pronunciation. You'll hear the cities called different things. There are some mistakes made later in terms of pronunciation that we didn't realize had happened until Aaron and I actually saw it. Like it was, and at that point there were no reshoots going to happen. But there sometimes are, when you put in a bunch of terms, it can turn out well. Other times it creates separate problems. What you will see, though, as the episodes go by, more and more specific terminology will get included. We had tried back then phonetically to get it to kind of be pronounced a particular way, but you also have to remember you're working with actors from all over the world. And then I always like to remind people that we don't always even know for sure, no matter how much, the philologists want to say, oh, it's pronounced this way, that way, or this way. Ancient Rome and areas it covered a vast, just array of geographies and peoples and different languages and everything else. And even variations in how actual terms would be pronounced in antiquity probably would have a pretty big degree of variance. And then as the centuries have gone by, how things are pronounced to a modern audience for recognizability versus how the terms might have been applied in antiquity, there can be a lot of variance there. And even the choice of, for episode 105 with Theocles, and I kind of went back and I looked at some of the notes. Original name of that character was just supposed to be Theocles, very simple, had a specific meaning. Choices were made by the writers where they wanted to change it simply for actors, how they wanted syllables to sound, and so the name was altered. And then Aaron followed up with, okay, if you're going to change the name here, you have all of these other meanings that can be created about what you do. And then it kind of just got set what it was. But since the show ended, I've actually seen write-ups where people try to guess as to why or what the secret meaning is for this and that. A lot of times it doesn't. I mean, I'm seeing entire articles write this stuff up. The choice was it was Theocles first and simply, and it had a very basic meaning. Choices were made simply for how things sounded in relationship to the modern audience. The information was given as to what the changes would mean, and then it was just implemented. And I think it was implemented for comic reasons and Comic-Con and everything else. And then you'll see years after, people try to write it up with some kind of sophisticated meaning. It's not that. And I want Aaron to chime in on that because he was, he knows whereof as I speak, how complex this is with the language and the terminology issue.
Yeah, it ultimately comes down to why are you including the ancient version of the word? What do you want to accomplish by calling it, here's your practice sword versus here's your rudus? And in calling it a rudus, are you going to lose the audience? Are you going to have to take an additional beat to bring the audience with you? Or by including, let's say, the Latin or the Greek, is this something that is going to help envelop the audience further into the world that you've created? Because it can go both ways, right? And that's sort of the judgment call. There's another example where in one of the later episodes in season 1, there's a reference to the city of Pompeii. And it's said while the screen is focused on a rather plump man who is there in the center of the screen. And one of the reviewers, because of the way that they pronounced Pompeii, thought that the rather plump man must be the figure of Pompey the Great. And so wrote the review as if this was the introduction of Pompey because of the way that the actors were pronouncing Pompeii. And it was this whole, this whole confusion. And this is exactly what Jeff is talking about when it comes to pronunciation. So you can include this word in terms of adding greater depth and adding greater dimensions and including the audience in this world that has this sort of Tolkien-esque backstory and enveloping your audience and so on. But all of these things have to fire correctly and all at the same time. And so much of that is then out of your control. You can write it down. You can write it down phonetically. You can add an audio recording of how to say it correctly, and then you send it off into the ether, and God only knows if it ends up the way that you all did it, and hopefully it comes across right, and you find out about that maybe 8 months to a year later, if it ends up correct. And hopefully it did, otherwise it screws up the whole episode. The other big example of that, of course, is Peter Mentz's character, who right now is just Doctore, and then later in the season, you find out his name is Enemaeus. That was a huge debate about how to pronounce that. And I mean, John Hannah at the time shared that he and Peter were going over lines and they ran across the line. Now you can, say your name, which has not been pronounced for the longest time. And both of them looked at the name and looked at each other and went, I don't know. And then they just moved on. So I mean, we would love to include more of that stuff, but it ends up creating so many complications. And again, you've got to get back to, why are you including it? Does this break the story? Does this break the series? Does this break from the audience, or does this add something more? If you're presenting it to a room full of classicists, I'm sure they love it, but then they're probably freaking out about all sorts of other stuff in the show as well. If you're,
And we do have the
doing it,
doctore issue. Sorry to cut, just before you get off of it, Aaron, explain the doctore issue.
oh,
Because
Doctor, yeah.
and that is one of
Speaking of
the
Peter's character, yeah, Doctore, of course, is incorrect, because in Latin he should be Doctor, but then he is, Doctor Enemeus, and we talked about he's wandering the countryside curing people from their various diseases, and we talked about how he could be Doctor Enemeus, medicine man or something like that. And made all sorts of jokes about that, and Peter thought that was a great idea for a spin-off. We talked about that at one of the premieres or finales or something like that. We shared that with him, but that's why we made it Doctore, which is, I believe it might be both Italian and Spanish, one of those. Something else in a romance. But just to make it clear, this guy is not a medical doctor. He's not a scholar. This is some other title, right? Same thing with why Gladiatus is called Dominus and such, Dominus and Domina, rather than master, and then Lucy being referred to as mistress. Well, that has a whole bunch of different connotations, especially given her relationship with Crixus in the series, which is precisely why we went with Dominus and Domina. So there, the Latin gives you that extra dimension. There, the Latin helps you to tell the story, helps you to envelop the audience within that world, versus the English, which actually would get in the way of explaining who Batiatus and Lucretia are relative to the slaves.
That said, as it goes through different levels of production and different levels of writing, is where it starts out on paper one way. By the time it actually hits the screen, there's so many moving parts involved. And this also was 15 years ago. We're even doing audio files and things like that. It's a different thing than if we were, to do it today. So there was, and then they were shooting down in New Zealand. Aaron and I would not even see finished product on some of this till months after the fact. And at that point, especially with television production as opposed to film production, there were not going to be reshoots in that way. It's just a different thing. Maybe these days things can happen a little more seamlessly because of technology, that certain things can be done now that maybe couldn't have been done even 10, 15 years ago, to get a little bit tighter control on how some of these things come across in the practical terms on the screen when they show up.
Oh yeah, you got to remember, when this was shot, there's no streaming. This is, even dailies are being, mailed DVDs from New Zealand to Burbank, right? That's how dailies are being communicated back and forth and so on. So, emailing files, video files, that's not a thing when this is being made. You're still dealing with physical media that's going back and forth. So as things are changing and we're like, well, that's wrong. Well, too bad. We're not going to redo it. You're just kind of stuck with it that way.
Let's do parting thoughts then, shall we? Would you like me to recommend the first 6 episodes to anybody?
I would, with the caveat that the title is Blood and Sand. They're not kidding about the blood part. I mean, sand, yes, but sand is fine. I can watch sand, not a problem. So I would, not to everyone, certainly not to my husband, who will never watch this, ever. I will never ask him to. That would just be bad. But, my brother would probably love it. It's a fantastic story. Everyone is bad, which did make me sad a little bit. But a lot of them have, these redeeming little glimmers of humanity that shine through. And I was quite surprised at the end of episode, what I thought was 6, what is actually 5, when I thought Crixus was dead. I was not happy about that. And given that he spends most of the first 4 episodes being an absolute dick, that did surprise me. So I think it's very well written. It's very well filmed. Like I said, the whole aesthetic nature of it is very impressive, and it's quite immersive. So yes, I would recommend it.
And as a quick final one thing is that it was meant to push at the time in the rising of kind of the golden age of cable television back then, what was going to be allowed on cable. It was also one of the first things to actually shoot with high def kind of Lord of the Rings tech and stuff like that for TV. But because it was pushing those limits, it had to be on pay cable for a very, very, a set audience that was comfortable with what was actually being shown on screen. When they actually tried to cut it to show it on sci-fi, like to cut out everything that was needed to be cut out, it becomes virtually incomprehensible when you actually cut out all of the nuances to get it to a truly wide public broadcast audience. You have to chop so much out of it that adds to the nuance of the show. It really loses its coherence.
No, I can definitely see that. Lexi, you were familiar with this before we started. Do you have any thoughts upon having watched it again?
It reminded me why I love the show so much. I haven't seen it truly. I mean, this came out in 2010 or something like that. I don't think I've watched it since then. When I was actually in high school, which was, I don't know why my parents are letting me watch this in high school. Yeah, so I did not remember quite how bloody and rapey it is, but that does not really detract from my enjoyment of the material. And I think just being older and coming back to it is a really fun treat, because I can see how much kind of, history and stuff was actually added in a way that it might escape you if you're not a classicist. So yeah, I definitely would just put an age rating on it. What is it? TV 17 or maybe mature. I don't know. I'm not a parent. So yeah, though it's great. I'll probably end up binging the whole thing now that I don't have to wait week to week anymore, which is really, really nice. And I will say that
5-year-old, 6-year-old did come downstairs last night while I was wrapping up the last episode. I was like, pause, pause, pause. No, this is not for you. I love you. Go back to bed.
Oh, darn. Okay, well, yeah, no, it was super fun, but I will say that kind of just remembering bits of what was happening in real life, because I know that our wonderful lead actor Andy got cancer, and I believe he passed in 2011, and so they had to replace the actor in subsequent seasons. And I do sort of remember not loving those quite as much, because I really, really, really loved Andy's portrayal. So, but yeah, definitely would recommend just to a very mature audience.
And before we wrap up and say goodbye, I want to ask Aaron and Jeff, you both seem to have had very positive experiences working on this series and working with the team of people you worked with. Is it something that you would like to do again?
I will let you take that first.
We can, right? It is official. So
yeah, we're good.
Yeah, we are actually doing it again. So the new series, House of Asher, we are both working on it. We've been working on it, in fact, since last year. So yeah, we're back at it again, working with Stephen DeKnight and his crew. So it's been a lot of fun. I think a lot of our positive experience comes down to Stephen. The fact that he listened, the fact that he worked with us, the fact that he was just a blast and continues to be a blast to work with. And both of us have heard horror stories from other consultants working on other projects. I think Gladiator is the most famous one, where one of the consultants just got pissed and stormed off the set and just sort of disappeared to the ether and demanded her name be taken off of it, and so on. Even HBO Rome at the very end, a number of people who worked on that kind of took their names off of it and just did not enjoy the experience by the very end. And I think by the end of it, we were both exhausted. But as soon as Steven contacted us and we're like, hey, we're getting the gang back together, both of us were like, yeah, let's do it. I don't think there was any hesitation whatsoever. We were both like, yeah, absolutely. It was a blast to do. It's been a ton of fun doing it again. It is a lot of work, but yeah, it's a lot of fun. We had a great experience. And again, I chalk that up entirely to Stephen DeKnight. He is a great boss, a great producer, and he is just, I can't speak highly enough about him. He's great to work with and great to work for.
Yep. Yes, I agree wholeheartedly with Aaron on that. Stephen has been great. And the thing that Stephen allowed is Aaron and I could comment on everything. that was put in front of us, and we could see line by line, draft by draft, and we would send all of that information to Stephen. He would assess it. He would be presented with the history. He would include what he thought that he could. And even when he was out doing his press junkets and whatnot, he would also then credit what we were giving him, and then also explain to kind of, the general audience and the people following the press corps that there were going to be things changed for their artistic reasons, and the vision of the writers and the vision of the show from its entertainment, aspect. But that Steve was always careful in making sure that people knew that Aaron and I were giving him the best information we could possibly find on a variety of things. And they're not always particularly easy answers to come up with, because even our view of the ancient world is very, distorted, and the sources are problematic and often limiting. But Stephen was always ready to engage and put in what he thought he could when it would help the show. And we were able to put in all kinds of different Easter eggs that I'm actually quite proud of, that even, prominent Roman scholars would have to dig a little bit to even figure out where some of these Easter eggs are being pulled from. That sometimes they do get pretty deep, and they are very historical in nature. Other times, though, when things are portrayed on screen, there are other considerations where you are going to get significant deviations from historical context or that. But we try to do what we can to keep as much of the viable history in there as we can, and much of the sense of how we think, things could have gone. But it's for entertainment. The other thing, though, too, is even if there are historical deviations that can occur here and there, or the way certain things are presented, what we found, even as Blood and Sand was being created, is I believe we were able to put up a few way back in the day, just some basic blogs and stuff like that. And we could see that the audience was attracted to the story, the time period, and they may not have ever read the sources. And Aaron and I were given some opportunities where we could actually give a bit more historical commentary. And what we saw from some of those responses is that just population worldwide, sometimes they might be inspired to actually go read what the sources are, and to actually read those sources. And the sources are distorted and limited in their own way with their own problems, but at least it would inspire people to see a show and then engage in some intellectual curiosity and inquiry as to, what evidence do we actually have on that? And I find that invaluable. And I know for all of the problems, there are lots of different, professors and, various instructors at different levels, that it's hard, but they use different aspects of the show to engage in trying to use it as a vehicle to expose different parts of, modern populations to the ancient world. So in that sense, I think it actually is quite invaluable.
I do think that media receptions of the ancient world are one of the most important ways to get this information, as distorted, as ahistorical as it often is, but to get it out to people and say, hey, look, this exists, isn't it fantastic? And prompt them to then go and kind of do their own research in their own time.
Yeah, and I'm really looking forward to the new show. I mean, I think there's only like one teaser trailer released so far with footage from the original show. So
Yeah.
I can't wait to get
We
my
do not
first
have
take
the
on.
new footage ready for public consumption yet. Let's put it that way.
Darn. Well, I'm definitely looking forward to it. I'm super happy that I'm going to get to do this Spartacus rewatch just so I'm all caught up again. And I hope that we can help you guys promote the new show when it comes out as well.
We hope that as well.
Well, thank you guys so much for joining us. This has been a lot of fun. Again, I'm sorry I watched the wrong episodes, but I appreciate you answering my questions regardless.
Okay, we kind of lied. There's one last question. That's, where can people find or follow you on the internet if they want to know what you're working on?
The easiest place to find me is on my department website at the University of Missouri. Jeffrey Stevens. I'm in the Department of History at the University of Missouri. And as more things become available, I will put in the appropriate links on that website so people can follow what I'm doing there.
So yeah, I've got a page on academia.edu, Aaron Irvin, IRVIN. I've got all sorts of stuff posted there. Also, of course, have a page on IMDb, starting, of course, with this, but then also other projects as well, which include, I've got the series Roman Empire on Netflix. I'm on multiple seasons of that. Now I get to plug all these other things that I've done. Recently did a couple series on History Channel, one of which Dark Marvels, all sorts of torture devices and weapons and all sorts of fun stuff. That was a fun one to shoot. Another series, Ancient Empires, 3 episodes on Julius Caesar, Cleopatra, and Alexander the Great. That just aired last year. I'm in all of those episodes. What else did I do? Oh, and then coming up, I've got another series. This is on Jesus of Nazareth. This is called Jesus Crown of Thorns. And the first season of that is coming out soon. And there'll be 2 more seasons of that I'll be shooting soon. So I've got other projects and other media that'll be coming out. So if you're interested in any of that, that'll be on Academia and IMDb. And yeah, and of course, Spartacus stuff coming out soon as well.
And the new series will be Spartacus House of Asher.
House of Asher, yes.
We will be keeping our eyes open and looking out for that. Thank you both again. Thank you all for listening. Lexi, as always, thank you for being awesome. If you enjoyed our inaugural episode of our season of Rome, we will be back next week. We're going to be talking about the Gladiator movie. That's the first Gladiator movie. This was recorded before Gladiator 2 came out. We're very excited to review that eventually. And we will be joined by the fantastic people behind the Partial Historians podcast. So definitely come back next week for some more fun.
Hey, thanks for listening. Don't forget to leave us a review, and you can also follow us on social media at The Reading Party Podcast. If you'd like to leave us a book or movie suggestion, then email us at thereadingpartypod@gmail.com. See you next week.